Has another country in Africa's coup belt been taken by force?
Avons décidé de mettre fin au régime que vous connaissez.
This is the moment on Wednesday night when a group of soldiers announced they had taken control. The international community has condemned the move, and elected President Mohamed Bazoum says democracy will be saved. But how and when? I'm Andrea Sankian. Today's newsmaker is Niger. Niger's President Mohamed Bazoum has been removed from power. Soldiers appeared on national television late on Wednesday to make the announcement. A military spokesperson said they had taken control due to the deteriorating security situation in the West African country and declared that Niger's borders are now closed. A nationwide curfew is in place and all institutions are suspended. The military says President Bazoum's well-being will be protected. Bazoum, who was detained in the presidential palace for hours before that announcement, took to Twitter with the following statement.
The hard-won achievements will be safeguarded. All Nigerians who love democracy and freedom will see to it.
Well, Bazoum's election was the first democratic transition of power in a state that has witnessed 4 military coups since independence from France in 1960. There was also a thwarted coup attempt in the country in 2021, just days before Bazoum was due to be sworn in. Now, Niger is an important ally to the West. Last year, the European Union launched an operational partnership to fight migrant smuggling across sub-Saharan Africa. This could also complicate Western efforts to help countries in the Sahel fight religious extremists that have spread from Mali over the past decade. The U.S. says it's spent around $500 million since 2012 to help Niger boost its security and have condemned Wednesday's events.
I spoke with President Bazoum earlier this morning and made clear that the United States resolutely supports him as the democratically elected president of Niger. We call for his immediate release. We condemn any effort to seize power by force. We're actively engaged with the Niger government, but also with partners in the region and around the world. We'll continue to do so until the situation is resolved appropriately and peacefully.
And while Niger is facing this internal battle, multiple African leaders are in Russia, where Vladimir Putin has rolled out the red carpet for high-level talks. Russia is just one of several major actors now stepping up efforts to court political and economic influence on the continent. While Russia has called for the rapid release of Niger's president, Benin's leader, Patrice Talon, is in Niger on a mediation mission, while the AU and ECOWAS have released statements condemning the coup.
You
know that the main goal of the African Union since its creation is to promote peace and security in the continent. But unfortunately, we are living through events you are all aware of, that we face and we try to put an end to. And as you know, what just happened in Niger, I joined with the African Union and the communiqué it issued to strongly condemn the events in Niger, recommend the re-establishing of the constitutional order, and demand the immediate release of President Bazoum and his family.
So, should this be considered a coup d'etat in Niger or an attempted coup? And what could be the consequences for the Sahel and the world? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Abuja, Africa analyst and counterterrorism specialist David Otto. Also from the Nigerian capital is Kabir Adamu, a security risk manager and director at Beacon Consulting. And from Johannesburg, Africa analyst and journalist Adetunji Omotola. Thanks all so much for being with us. Kabir, I'll start with you. First, what can you tell us about what is actually happening now? Has the military succeeded in taking power in Niger, or is this a serious but still temporary shakeup?
Thank you very much. What we know so far is that it's what started like a mutiny by the Presidential Guard, where they indicated that part of their reasons was because of the conditions, the very dire conditions that they found themselves in. So they spoke about their welfare, they spoke about the deficit in military equipment, has now degenerated into a full-blown coup d'etat. that yesterday night, a statement was released by the military where they showed clearly that they have taken over the government and that they've suspended democratic governance. We've seen protests in at least 3 parts of Niger, including Niamey, the city by different groups, some supporting the military action, while others condemning it and pledging their support, as it were, to democratic governance.
Right.
We've also seen a tweet by the sitting president where he's indicated he's been very diplomatic. He's indicated that the democratic governance will be supported, but he's not indicated whether he's in control of the government. So it appears that the coup has succeeded. Yes, ECOWAS and other developing countries, the US, France, EU, name them, they've all released statements condemning the action. But it appears that the military junta has taken hold of the government.
So, David, do you believe democracy will be restored? And at the very least, when will institutions be reestablished and borders be reopened?
I mean, when you look at the history of coup d'etats in the Sahel, examples of Mali and Burkina Faso, but also Guinea, I can tell you that whether we would have democracy being restored in Niger Republic after what we've seen, in the past 24 hours, I think it's quite doubtful now. Principally because these new coup beneficiaries, they do have some leverage in terms of they're neighboring the takeover members, Burkina Faso being also beneficiary for coup d'etat, Mali being a beneficiary for coup d'etat. So, the military junta knows that it does have, some high level of leverage to work on. That would, practically mean it would be very difficult for them to be pressured by, regional bodies like ECOWAS to either, hand over democratic powers, to a civilian government, as quickly as they would like to. So it puts them in a very strong position. But I was really, bit worried yesterday when, well, not worried, but, surprised when a lot of media were talking about an attempted coup. This was clearly a coup in process. It had all the characteristics of securing the president, negotiating with other sister forces, securing critical infrastructure and drafting your statement. But the question now is, what country is next? As we envisage some kind of a tsunami of coup d'etats happening in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa.
I mean, the list has grown to 7 already. It's crushing to think that more could fall as well. But let me turn to Adetunji quickly, and if you can, talk about why this has happened. I mean, it was only in 2021 when Bazoum was elected, and it was the first democratic transition of power in Niger. How has it unraveled this quickly?
Well, look, I have always said, firstly, that Africa, we want democracy. We say no coups. Even President Bola Tinubu, as chairman of ECOWAS, his first statement was that they're not going to tolerate more coups in Africa. But if you look around Africa, at least more than a dozen countries in Africa still have presidents who have been in power for more than 20 years. We can look in any region. And in some cases, you have political parties that have been in power since the liberation of their country. So what worries me is that there's, if you like, a double speak. We don't want coups, but we don't condemn governments that are sitting tight for 4 decades or more. It is quite embarrassing to be seeing coups at this late stage in Africa's history of independence. But let me say to you what I've noticed. Mohamed Bazoum, the president of Niger Republic, first of all, before he took his seat of office in 2011, there was an attempted coup which failed. I also saw that Mohamed Bazoum is the first Difa Arab, a Nigerian born in Niger of Arab descent, who has taken power in Niger. So that is interesting. It's quite curious because if you remember in 2006, the Nigerian government sought to deport over 150,000 what they call Mohammedis, the Nigerians of Arab extraction. So why is it then? Is it a coincidence or what that the first Arab Nigerian president has been removed barely 2 years into his presidency? So
Interesting
I
point.
see some ethnic undertones, and I also see parallels between this coup and the coup that happened in Nigeria in July of 1966.
Okay.
What they call the July.
But
So it's quite
Adetunji, I have to
bizarre.
interrupt you there, just because you've made a very interesting point about what you think are ethnic roots to this military takeover. But I can see David was disagreeing with you there. David, quickly, why? Do you think that is not an issue at play?
Well, I don't think we should dive into ethnicity at this point in time. I want to look at it from a very, strategic point. I know that the coup plotters have mentioned, governance, in disarray, insecurity at the very low. Of course, these are excuses, but these are also reality. And if you look at the agreement that was made between the paramilitary forces and the Nigerian army, which of course the president was expecting perhaps that the army would stand on his behalf. I don't think it's down to ethnicity here. I think what is happening is that a set of military guys, believe that coup d'etats have succeeded in their neighboring states, of course, Mali and Burkina Faso, and these leaders are continuously relying on them to keep them in power. So they saw the opportunity, they grabbed it. As simple as that.
Okay, let me come to Kabir, because you'd mentioned that, in a sense, democracy is actually failing as a system in West Africa. Is it failing as a system, or is it just being instituted by the wrong people? It's Adetunji's point as well, that this is why we're seeing these so-called democratically elected governments fail the people to the point that democracy really doesn't serve much of a purpose for the populace.
So I think it's a mixed bag in the sense that the reaction of, it is difficult to generalize Africa, but the point I wanted to make is that the reaction of the generality of Africans is that, yes, democracy has a purpose, but sadly, over time, the implementation of democratic tenets and traditions have been quite weak in most African countries. And I think one of the discussants made that point. You've got countries where you have the heads of states, the president sitting for, over, in one case, 30 years or even longer than that. And sadly, what we call the dividends of democracy locally here in Nigeria are not being felt by a lot of African countries. And I think in summary, it's about governance. It's about how governance relates to development within the local populations. And once people cannot relate that system of government to their development, they cannot, the basic necessities of life, food, clothing, and shelter, they are not able to afford it. Then it's just a matter of time if we question that system of government.
Right.
And sadly, those who are creating that system of government are not able to make that differentiation. We can spend time talking about the various tenets of democracy, the role of the civil media society, the role of the media itself, and then, of course, the role of the various branches in government. Sadly, in all of that, we've not seen enough progress in most African countries.
Right. Adetunji, we're seeing these democracies unravel in individual states, and then there are these overarching organizations such as ECOWAS or the African Union, and you ask, what can they actually do in these situations? Because if they start condemning these military coups and trying to isolate military takeovers, they'll have no members in the Sahel region in particular.
Yes, look, I think that for me personally, when I look at the composition of ECOWAS, the countries that really have weight in ECOWAS, I mean, probably Ghana, Nigeria, maybe one more country, maybe Cote d'Ivoire, but then Cote d'Ivoire's president is in a third term, which ought not to have happened. But of course, the successor that he chose then died, and they were left with a dilemma. So Alassane Ouattara decided to go for an illegal third term. So, and when you look at Nigeria, the president is still battling with a court case. There's still doubts about his legitimacy. He also had only about 35% of the popular vote. So there are challenges there. So it's very difficult in West Africa at the moment to see a leader that has that moral authority, maybe like former President Obasanjo and so on, who could speak to these issues that bedevil the region, particularly coups.
Right.
But for me, I look at the history of the country. Which country are we talking about? I mean, despite the fact that the United States has spent well over $500 million in Niger Republic, they're having coups after coups. If you look at their history, their first president, Amani Diori, was removed in a coup. And then the guy who removed him in a coup himself, Seni Kunche, died in office after about 11 years.
Okay.
And they've had several coups after. So it's very difficult for ECOWAS, really, my view, unless they find some kind of moral gravitas over the next few weeks. But I don't see any leadership that can change much under ECOWAS. And I say Niger is not Gambia. So they're two different countries, because Niger is more strategic.
Okay.
So you need a lot more international pressure. There's got to be international pressure on Niger, particularly the junta, to get out of office and to restore democracy in the country. As I alluded to earlier, a minority leader has been kicked out, is a Difa Arab. There's some undertones there for me, but I do know that they have some excuses that tend to be bandied around every coup.
Let me go to David. I also have to ask you about the, being the counterterrorism analyst here, what this means, for the global battle, actually, against the militants in the Sahel. And if, religious extremists are actually not stopped, what happens, not just in Niger, but the region and the world? And then where do these international players get involved, not least Russia and even the Wagner Group, coming to be employed, as it has in other African countries, to stop these threats?
Well, we're all cognizant of the fact that, geopolitics is at play. We're seeing, the situation with Russia picking the pockets of France. Perhaps this is another occasion where Russia could annoy France, perhaps annoy the United States with its drone bases in Niger Republic. In terms of the fight against insurgency, as you can tell, the juntas made mention of the fact that one of the reasons why they were taken over was because of insecurity, and that would be directly related perhaps to the insurgency in that region. But the question is, the military has been involved in the fight principally against the insurgency. So what are they going to do different from what they did before the coup? So there's the question about the practicalities of what they say. But how will this impact on the war against terror? I mean, the global war on terror, as they call it, has always been a problem because they talk about coordination and collaboration. We talk about agency, synergy, but this is not going to happen. I mean, Niger Republic is a member of the multinational joint task force. This will impact seriously on Nigeria, which has a very porous border with Niger Republic. So the question now is, how does Nigeria cope how does it leverage, its position by saying, okay, we are, chairing the ECOWAS, so we're condemning the coup, but at the same time, how do we collaborate with you on the multinational joint task force? So there's a problem there. But also in the Sahel, as you remember, the French forces had transferred some of their troops from Operation Barkhane away from Mali to Niger Republic. So they were looking for a safe haven. So what happens to that? So instability is a big issue, especially when you have a junta taking over from a democratic system. That brings some level of chaos. But when it comes to the war on terror, it's all about planning, it's all about strategy. Let's see what these guys come up with. But I have no hopes in that as we speak.
Kabir, it wasn't long ago when Niger was called the West's only hope in the Sahel region for several reasons. Do you think that characterization was justifiable at the time, and is it now, given what's happened? And what happens to those ever crucial, especially to the European Union, migration patterns and the cooperation agreements specifically built with Niger over that issue?
So a lot would depend on what the military junta does over the next few days, and more importantly, what both the regional as well as multilateral bodies do in responding to this, truncation of democracy. On the one hand, the strategic importance of Niger has been emphasized by David, especially to the sub-region, as it were, and to Nigeria. Now, how that plays out in terms of the way the world responds to development there, and we need to also buttress the point around Niger's role after developments in Mali. And I must also say the failure of intelligence in recent times not to have been able to identify and these indicators that would have led to what we're discussing today. So all of this would determine the next moves. What is clear is that the world cannot isolate Niger at the moment due to development in the sub-region and within the Sahel region. So one thing that would likely play out is, on the one hand, this strong statements, diplomatic stand, but this is when I think backdoor channels that are represented by intelligence groups and associations would now have to play a hand. Of course, the other soft components of soft power, the individuals who over time have extensive relationships with these persons who organize the coup, and perhaps those that are even behind them that are currently silent will play a role. So all of this would play out to determine what we'll see in the coming days.
Adetunji, backdoor channels, but kind of mediated by whom? Who are going to be the dominant voices in these conversations going forward in Niger about who takes what power reins, which international players will be given influence? Where do you see it going?
Look, we've already seen U.S. Secretary David Blinken speak directly to the issue in Niger. I mean, the U.S. from a strategic, or rather economic standpoint, they've been the country that has invested the most in terms of the security architecture in Niger. I believe that the U.S. will try and impress on the new junta to ensure that democracy comes back. Of course, they have a very good pact with the government of Niger already. So at least the military in Niger, they would be fully aware of that. But I don't think that the ECOWAS, even though we've seen Patrice Talon go there, but that was even before the coup was in its full advanced stages. So for them to have taken over, despite Patrice Talon's intervention, or rather ECOWAS, tells us that ECOWAS does not really have the same weight that they ought to have, especially at this critical time. But I believe that the AU, the mother body of ECOWAS, the AU, still has a lot of weight. And I'm suspecting that the Peace and Security Council will weigh in very quickly on this matter. And I think Nigeria also, as a strong neighbor, can also still try and muscle into the process. But I'm not too sure whether we can do that very quickly because of the local dynamics in Nigeria.
Okay.
Too many factors.
Down to our last minute, David, very quickly, do you see any potential for a silver lining somewhere in this troubling news in Sahel right now?
I don't think there is any potential for some hope. What I would expect to see, I mean, ECOWAS has instituted what it calls early warning centers, and that should be very critical in terms of providing it with ways of preventing these coup d'etats, but also stopping, as my colleagues have said, preventing leaders from running terms or changing the constitution. Now, what we're seeing, as we speak, is Russia holding the African summit in St. Petersburg. And, so politics is at play here. We would like to see what happens next, because Russia is perhaps going to lean towards the junta. The US is going to find it very disturbing because it has a huge military base in Niger. France is going to find it very challenging because, of course, that was his last bastion.
Okay.
So what we're seeing here is geopolitics at play, and democracy is increasingly, facing, a deterioration. The question now is what next?
Right. We'll have to leave it with that question. I'm sure we'll be checking in with all three of you as this story moves forward. But I have to leave it there for now. That is all the time we have for this edition of The Newsmakers. So thank you, all three of my panelists, so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We will see you next time.